Well, good evening, everybody. As Debbie mentioned, thank you, Debbie. My name is Kerry McLeod, and it is my honour to be speaking to you this evening on behalf of the Neurological Foundation. So it's my absolute pleasure to warmly welcome everybody here tonight. Thank you so much for joining us for this panel discussion on this very important subject and topic around understanding autism and learning differences. Thank you. That's a bit I forgot to do. It is such a pressing challenge facing so many children, families, parents and communities. So we really appreciate your interest and your support tonight. So this event, as Debbie mentioned, is part of Brain Awareness Month. Neurological Foundation runs, along with key partners in the community, a whole month of celebration, really. So tonight is one of 18 events being hosted or co-hosted by the Neurological Foundation to really celebrate and share the amazing research that's going on in this field. And we're delighted tonight to be partnering with the University of Auckland Centre for Brain Research and Brain Research New Zealand. And I know that the whole team is really looking forward to a great evening of listening and learning from our expert speakers. So there are over 1,100 different neurological conditions. And this figure is sometimes a bit of news to people. So in New Zealand, it's 1 in 5 Kiwis will be affected directly by a brain disorder or disease, which means that just about everybody in the audience this evening, which is quite a large auditorium, will have been directly impacted themselves. It could be you yourself, could be a loved one, could be a dear friend. And often, many times when people think of neurological disorders, they immediately jump to those conditions that are perhaps more commonly associated with advancing age or degenerative conditions. We think here of conditions such as dementia, Parkinson's or Alzheimer's maybe. Even stroke is often considered to be a condition that will strike down people as we get older, and as we know, it really can hit anyone at any stage. However, as you probably know from your personal interest in tonight's subject, neurological disorders do not discriminate, and they do affect people of all ages. And it's the drive to combat these disorders and diseases and provide a pathway to hope for everyone affected. And that's basically the Neurological Foundation's mission. So really, research is the absolute key. It's key to finding answers. It's key to developing treatments, to providing hope, and ultimately working towards delivering cures for the many conditions the researchers are working so hard on. But it's really only through the generous support of committed Kiwis that the Foundation is able to fund the research into such varied conditions. So it's thanks to the very generous support from the community that the Foundation has been able to fund over $13 million worth of groundbreaking research since 2014 alone. Along with these projects, scholarships, fellowships, and the work that is going on, we also do fund, through the generosity of the community, the Neurological Foundation Human Brain Bank, which is a world-renowned and a vital facility which is housed right here in the Centre for Brain Research. It also includes the funding for the chair of the clinical neurology and has done for the past 10 years with, as you can see at the moment, Professor Alan Barber is our current chair, and he's doing amazing work with his team focusing on stroke and clot retrieval. So it's the donations that have enabled this long history of incredible research, and we truly are so thankful for the Foundation's generous donors who continue to invest in funding groundbreaking research. And it's the support that I speak of, that probably come from many of you this evening, that has directly funded some of the impressive work that we're going to be hearing about this very evening. And on that note, I am delighted to be able to introduce you to Dr. Rosamund Hill. Dr. Hill is a clinical neurologist based here in Auckland, and she will be leading our panel discussion this evening. So I ask you now to please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Hill to the podium, well, to the chair, actually, as we kick off this evening's event.
Welcome. I would just like to introduce my fellow panel members. We're each just going to say a few words about the work that we're doing. As I am a clinical neurologist and see patients and I'm not actually doing research, I'm chairing the evening. My sort of role in this is twofold. So obviously I'm specialise in diseases of the brain, and actually I've always been interested in autism. And then about 13 years ago, my second child, Claude, was diagnosed with autism. So my hope is that in some way, having training as a specialist in diseases of the brain and having a very close personal relationship with Claude, that I can try and sort of improve the understanding and connect things like understanding the research and how that relates to individuals who either have the condition themselves or have family members with it. Autism is such an amazing, fascinating condition. As a neurologist, it's the only condition I can think of where the spectrum of the condition spans from severely disabled, like my son Claude, through to things that are just amazing and are advantages in many ways to how your brain works. There doesn't seem to be anything good about having a little bit of Parkinson's disease or a little bit of MS, but autism is in a unique condition of the brain in which there are some things that are incredible. I think of autism when I look at my son particularly and try and understand what's going on in his brain. I think of it as a sort of a wiring connection problem. So the brain is made up of grey matter we talk about and white matter. So the grey matter are the actual brain cells, and the white matter are the sort of the wiring and the connections. And as you all know, we've got billions of brain cells and billions of connections. So cells are receiving information and they're communicating with hundreds and thousands of other cells. And that's fundamentally what's going on in your brain. So what's wrong in the autistic brain, or what's different about the autistic brain? So I think of it as a connection wiring problem. So some cells are getting too much information, some areas of the brain are getting too many connections. Now potentially that could be a good thing, and in some areas of brain function like visual function, some people with autism, their brains work amazingly. Photographic memories, they can remember things. Even Claude, who can't talk and severely disabled, if I take him somewhere he hasn't been for a few years, he will know exactly where to go. So sometimes that over-connection is a good thing, but sometimes I think it's a big problem. So when I look at him and I say something to him, and sometimes he might understand what I'm saying, sometimes he has clearly no idea what I'm saying. I think it's that kind of signal to noise problem. Sometimes the connections get through, sometimes there's just too much noise in the system and he just can't understand. So there is so much about the autistic brain we don't understand, but I myself try to think about it as a problem with the wiring and connections. So I'm going to ask Jo Montgomery to maybe start and just talk a little bit about the research she's doing, and then we'll each say a bit and then open the floor for your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Ros. So what I work on actually follows on from Ros was just speaking about. So when I describe the kind of research that goes on in my lab, I always think of it as looking at how brain cells work at the nuts and bolts level. So what we look at are how brain cells communicate, and then how that goes wrong in a number of different disorders. And autism is one of the major focuses in my lab. And so here you can see in this cartoon, here we can see some cartoon neurons or brain cells. And if you look here at a close-up, this is the connection. This is what the connections look like, a synapse that connect. And there's somewhere in the order of 10 trillion synapses in your brain. And so the research in my lab focuses on where this communication is happening. And we're interested in knowing, well, how is brain cell communication different in the autistic brain? And we've done some work to show that in a specific region of the brain called the hippocampus, that's really important for learning and memory, that we find that brain cell communication there is significantly decreased. But actually, depending on what autism-specific genetic changes you may have, that can actually differ in other regions of the brain. We're also really interested in, so there's a broad number of autism-associated genetic changes that have been found in people, And are the differences in how brain cells communicate, are they the same in everyone, or are they actually quite different? And then, of course, what we want to be able to do is try and reverse these changes that are happening in brain cell communication. And whether if we reverse the changes that are happening at this nuts and bolts level at how brain cells communicate, if we reverse those changes, does that then result in changes at the behavioural level? And so my lab has a major interest in heavy metals, and we've done quite a lot of research in zinc. And using model systems that we haven't yet taken to the human, what we are looking at is, so first of all, we have found that you can reverse some autism-associated behavioural symptoms with heavy metal changes in the diet. And we're really interested in trying to figure out what the timing of that treatment is. So for example, can you start by treating the mother through pregnancy, postnatal, and then right out to the adult. Also in my lab, and this is led by Dr. Juliet Chain here, is how brain cell communication can cause sensory issues in autism spectrum disorders as well. And so she has a major focus on the auditory cortex as well, and that also can then feed into obviously how language may be affected in autism. And then finally, we're interested in how, with autism, how the microbiome can actually be altered. And because we know now that the gut will talk to the brain and can actually alter how the brain is functioning. And so we're interested in trying to figure out how these dietary changes may then actually alter how the gut talks to the brain and potentially use that as a potential therapeutic pathway. So I finished by thanking all the people in my lab that work in this. So I mentioned Juliet before, who's working on the auditory work, Yukti, Kevin and Yewon, who work on the timing of the treatment and also on whether we can see differences in different autism-associated mutations, and Maya, who works with Juliet, and Giselle, who's working on the microbiome work. And I'll finish there.
So I'm Karen Waldie, and I work in the School of Psychology here at the University of Auckland. But I'm originally from Canada, so I did my undergraduate at the University of Victoria, BC, and then went on for postgraduate studies at the University of Calgary. And during there, I was specialized in neuropsychology, and I was particularly interested in developmental disorders, which are a group of conditions identified in childhood that involve serious impairment in different areas of cognition. In particular, I'm interested in dyslexia, dyscalculia, ADHD, and autism spectrum disorder. And before talking about my research, I just thought I'd mention, I was struck by what Roz said about autism being a spectrum. And just a few personal anecdotes. So we've got, on the very severe end, I spent 4 years as an undergraduate working as a caregiver at a residential hospital in Victoria, BC, Queen Alexandra Hospital for Children. And so we had a lot of children who lived there at the severe end of the autism spectrum, and we also had children that would come in on respite for 1 night or up to 2 weeks, who are more high functioning. But on the lower end, some of the kids I worked with, for example, Peter would spend probably about 90% of his time rocking back and forth, that self-stim behavior, and flapping. If he had a sock, even better. And he was nonverbal. In the middle part of the spectrum, an example would be Christy, who, when I first saw her, she was a little girl that came in on respite, about 10, and she looked like an absolute angel, and she walked into the room on her tippy toes, a toe walker, which is very common, and she came straight up to me and looked me in the eyes, and then just started touching my face, and I started speaking with her, and she was fascinated. And I thought, this child isn't autistic, this child doesn't have autism, because one of the diagnostic features is that lack of eye gaze, they say, that joint attention, and she finds me absolutely riveting. Aren't I special? And we spent some time getting to know each other. She's non-verbal, and we went outside for a walk. And I realized pretty quickly that the attention that she was giving me, she went up to a tree and touched the tree in the exact same magical way. And I felt maybe not so special, but it gave me some insight into the autistic brain. And I'm starting to say the word autistic person now, because on the higher end of the spectrum, I have co-supervised a PhD student with autism, and we currently have a student in our postgraduate year who would like to be referred to as an autistic person, not a person with autism. So, in other disorders, we would say a child with dyslexia, because it's just one part of their functioning, that reading and spelling problem, or dyscalculia with the mathematics, the number sense. It doesn't define those individuals, but I think people with autism, or some people, it does define them, and they're very proud that it defines them. And so these are very high-functioning people at this high end. And really, you might not know that they're autistic. There might be a bit of social awkwardness. There might be a failure of direct eye gaze. And, once or twice I've had to say, you can now leave the office, thank you. I've had a few phone calls on the weekends that might not be 100% appropriate, but other than that, these are very high-functioning people. So we really have an extreme spectrum, and it is about 1% to 3% of our general population. Okay, so just briefly on to my research. I do EEG, and I also do fMRI in my experimental work. I also work on big longitudinal studies, so tracking a big cohorts of people over time. With my brain imaging research, I'm interested in both the cognitive markers, some of which I've included up here, but also biological markers. And it took me, so I've been at the University of Auckland for about 20 years, and it took me quite a few years to become interested in what we say comorbidity, or just coexisting conditions. I would run a study and have an advertisement for a call for participants, and I'd say I'd like to have individuals with a diagnosis of ADHD or suspected or autism or whatever, and it would take me a long time to kind of wheedle it down to just individuals with that one disorder, and I'd be discarding all these hopeful participants because they had all these different coexisting conditions, until I finally realized what made it interesting is that these people had these coexisting conditions. So about a half of my individuals with dyslexia will have dyscalculia. About half of those with autism will also have ADHD, and a lot of them will also have anxiety disorders. And yeah, I'm interested in why that is, and really, are they separate disorders or just more severe aspects of one disorder? So we're doing a lot of that sort of work. And ultimately, we hope that we can use this research to help the community and provide some answers like we're doing today.
Kia ora koutou katoa. My name's Jessie, and I'm a genetic researcher here at the University of Auckland. I learned fairly early on in my undergrad how wonderfully unique and intricate the human brain is, and in fact I have Sir Richard to blame for that. And that fascination still remains with me today, and in fact, remarkably, last Friday I was actually in Sir Richard's office with my 2-year-old, of all things, showing him a model brain and pointing out where the pituitary gland was, and at some point I thought, gosh, this poor kid doesn't stand a chance. He's already at 2 and I've got a brain. But it's just such a fascinating part of my life. And it's actually really cool to be able to share it with those around me. So today, my research is more down at the cellular level, and in fact what resides in the centre of those cells, which is DNA. Or the genetic blueprint, which carries instructions for how we develop and function as humans. Now, variation in that DNA is what makes us all wonderfully unique. It contributes to how we look, our personalities, our preferences, and can contribute to health and wellness. And that's the latter part is what I focus on. So in a nutshell, I look for changes in DNA that might affect the way the developing brain works. And I have a special interest in neurodevelopmental disorders and particularly autism. So why the genetics of autism? Well, we've known from about the 70s that genetics plays a huge role. And this was done initially by identical twin studies. The more recent epidemiological data that's come out has shown that genetics accounts for about 83%, has about an 83% component. So more recently we've had this massive advance in sequencing technology which allows us to survey an entire person's DNA or genome. And then we can look for changes in that genome and look for things that might contribute to or cause autism. And it's much like reading a book, essentially opening a book, looking for changes in the way words are spelt or looking for paragraphs that might be either missing or moved to a different location. And maybe not so remarkably, the genetics is really complex. And maybe that's not surprising because it's such a broad condition with many different clinical presentations. So we have been really successful in our endeavours here, and Ros says she doesn't do any research, but in fact she's a very integral part of our research, and that's actually one of the reasons I love my job, is I get to work with people like Ros. But we've actually had a lot of fun together. We've been, I have to say, rather successful in what we've been doing. We've probably sequenced probably upwards of 300 families in New Zealand with autism. And it's been a really incredible journey. And I just thought I'd point out three really nice stories of families that have been involved in our research. One was a family where we identified a deletion off the end of one of the chromosomes, or sort of the way we package our DNA. And it's essentially like missing the conclusion of a book. And for that family, we realised that everyone who had that same deletion went on later in life to have particular heart and kidney conditions. So for that family, they can now proactively screen to monitor those conditions that we know will occur later in life. For another family, they presented, they had a boy with autism and epilepsy, and for them we actually found a change in a way, essentially a word is spelt in the DNA. And that meant we could tailor our treatment options for his epilepsy. And finally, perhaps most surprisingly for me and probably most broad-reaching, is that it's really nice to be able to deliver an answer for a family just to know. Whether that be just to have some understanding of why the child is the way they are, or being able to plan for the future. And that's probably, almost for me, one of the biggest impacts that's been real for our research. So it's all really fun to be part of, and I'd like to thank all of you here today who have been involved. I realise that spitting in tubes isn't potentially the most glamorous thing to do in your spare time, but we're really appreciative for all those who have been involved in the research. And in fact, that project really spurred the development of our Minds for Minds New Zealand Autism Research Network, and in fact, everyone here on the panel tonight is part of. And it's basically a way to bring people together from all different disciplines to help better understand autism, because it is a really complex condition and it needs to be studied from all different angles. And it's a partnership between researchers, clinicians and the public. So if you want to find more about that or more about our genetics research, you can just look for Minds on the web. And at that, I'll pass it back to Ros.
Thank you so much, everybody. So I'm going to open the floor for questions. So we're talking predominantly about the research that's going on here. So if it's possible to tailor your questions, particularly if they're sort of personal or about somebody you know, in a sort of a broad sense, so it will be of interest to everybody. It's difficult for us to answer specific questions about specific individuals, if that's okay. So anybody got a question would like to start things off? We've got some microphones and these kind of graduate students will whip one along. Anybody got, okay, shall I start? Oh, yep.
Someone mentioned zinc being a today. Can that be expanded upon?
All done.
Well done.
So yeah, our research at the moment has examined how changing dietary levels of zinc can influence autism-associated behaviours in a very specific genetic change that occurs in probably one of the more frequent ones in a protein called SHANK, which is a protein that's localised to those connections between brain cells. And there are a number of different autism-associated disorders as well where there are issues in this protein. And what we found at a cellular level is that zinc actually recruits more of this protein to the brain cell connections. And because this protein plays such an integral role in basically forming sort of the scaffold or the backbone of brain cell connections, having more of this protein can be a good thing and can certainly strengthen how brain cells communicate. At this stage, this has just been looked at in model systems. We haven't gone to the human yet. That's where we plan to go in the future. Also in human cells, so in collaboration with Mike Dragonoff in the Centre for Brain Research, we actually can grow human brain cells in the lab. When patients have certain brain surgeries, they can donate some of the normal tissue to us and we can grow them in the lab. So one of the next aims is actually to look at the influences of zinc in these human brain cells and then go to the human level.
What resources do parents and teachers have to support learning for those with autism, ADHD and ASD, for example, if any?
Can you say that again? What resources do
Parents and teachers have to support learning for those with autism, ADHD, ASD, the like, if any?
That's a very big question. And we have some experts in the audience here, I know, in the front row, who could probably answer that much better than me. So I guess the process, and I guess I'm talking a little bit from my personal journey, is, so first of all, you need an accurate diagnosis. And in order to know what exactly the issue is that the child is dealing with, is it a combination of all of those things or just one of them in particular? And usually that comes obviously via your GP or via a specialist. And then ideally the specialist should direct what the follow-up and input's going to be. Most of the input is generally behavioural and educational rather than medical treatment. So the only medical treatment is obviously of those comorbidities, of other things that are going along. So you may treat the ADHD, you will treat the seizures generally. So then it's handed over, I guess, to the Ministry of Health and Ministry of Education. So once you've got a diagnosis, then it's a case of what is needed to support that child either in a preschool or once they get to school. There's obviously never enough to go around, and we all know that there's a huge struggle in the school system having enough support for a child who's trying to learn, often in an environment that's very challenging, and that is very difficult. So it's a difficult issue. It's a little bit out of our area of expertise, but I would certainly acknowledge that we do struggle in New Zealand to get enough support, and teachers in schools really do have a huge job in trying to manage these children who have special needs and require support. It is an ongoing challenge, but I guess it's the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Health whose job it is to assess in the home and then in the school as to what's going to be most helpful.
And some of our
Some
of our community partners, like Autism New Zealand, Children's Autism Foundation, they provide certain programs for families at all different levels. And I know Autism New Zealand have regional groups all across New Zealand, and so there's lots of quite a few community organisations which are incredibly well run and motivated.
Very important.
I'd like to add one more thing. Yeah. Just in general, talking about the neurodevelopmental disorders in general, I think what's needed is more teacher education. So really the teachers aren't getting told what these disorders are, how they affect the individual's learning, where to go through. So I think that's one area that New Zealand lacks. It's far behind other countries I've been to, not all countries certainly, but I think it does start with education. So just knowledge is power. And a lot of the teachers now, even those that are now getting trained, there's no teacher training specifically, only elective courses. They could take, I think, one elective course on any diversity in learning.
I'd like to ask two questions, because one is on education. One is the open plan classrooms that are so popular these days. I just wonder how children with autism cope there. And once that's answered, if I can be greedy, and comment on what Jessie was saying, I was amazed that genetics plays such a high role here. And to an outsider, it seems that there's more people developing or being born with autism than ever before. What's the reason for that? I understand the percentage is about 1 in 100 in New Zealand, whereas it's considerably higher in the States.
I'll make a few comments on that and then pass over to Jessie. So one of the things I think that's important when we say it's very high genetic, doesn't necessarily mean the child has inherited it from the parents. I think it's really important to realise that genetics is referring to, yes, possibly inherited from the parent, or something new that's gone. So often it's something new's gone wrong in the DNA of that child. So it's both those things. So when we say genetic, don't just think of inherited. So that's the one point. We don't really know what the incidence in New Zealand is. So nobody's actually tested that. There's no reason to think we'd be any different to any other country in the world. And the latest reliable data from the US is 1 in 59, I think. So I think we don't know exactly. We say 1 in 100 because it kind of, it's an easy number to remember, and it's not far wrong. Well, it's likely to be in the ballpark. Why is it getting diagnosed more? That's a really tricky question. Possibly quite a lot of it is being diagnosed more rather than it's occurring more. So a lot of it is people are getting the diagnosis where previously they wouldn't get diagnosed. And one way you can tell that is occurring is that the number of people with the diagnosis who are intellectually impaired is going down and down, which means a lot of people who are being diagnosed are of average or above average intelligence. So those people previously probably didn't get diagnosed. So whether it's actually getting more frequent or not is, I think we don't really know the answer to that. So those are a few things I like to say. Jessie, do you want to comment about it?
Sure, that's great. Ros can just answer. It's brilliant. Whew, my job done. No, I think the other thing I will add is I completely agree with Ros. The genetics is really difficult to understand, and when I say there's the latest prediction estimates are 83%, I would say probably we understand about 10 to 30% of that. So lots of it is going to be combinations of lots of different genes working together. Some of it's going to be interactions with the environment. So there's going to be a lot of interplay there. And actually that's really hard to figure out, because you need large groups of people who have all grown up in the same place, eaten the same food, grown up in the same environment, and trying to control for all of those environmental factors to figure out what the key things are is actually really, really hard. Which is why I like to focus on the easy stuff, which is the DNA. But so even though we know genetics plays a huge role, it's really difficult to figure out. And that's why we're working so hard to try and understand it. And the remarkable thing is we're learning about new types of genetic variation that we still didn't, that we weren't even aware of. We've got, we've got a couple of kids who are profoundly affected that have upwards of like 20 different breaks in their DNA, and the cell's done its best to try and stitch those all back together. And that's something that, we weren't even aware of 10, 15 years ago. So we're understanding more and more. In terms of the rise in the apparent rise, undoubtedly over decades there's been an increase. And there will be an environmental play, I'm sure. But as I said, it's hard to figure out. But I, as Ros said, the majority, I think there is a big increase in uptake of diagnosis. I think the latest Centre for Disease Control and Prevention report, which Ros talked about, I think with the 1 in 59, a big portion of that, I think, included ethnic groups which previously hadn't, been wildly included previously, or now they're being better accessed and included. And I think also they might have talked, I think, potentially, I could have this wrong, about females, to an increase in females being diagnosed as well. So I think, as Ros pointed out, it's a lot of that probably is some of the more people who are less profoundly affected. Classroom.
No to the big classrooms. Yeah, I think that's a challenge. As Natalie said, it's the sensory issues. So some of the things for a young child at school, it's the sensory issues and the routine. So my nephew, who's also on the spectrum but at the high end, it used to drive him crazy, things like, he liked to hang his bag on the same hook and things like that. And if you have, a very large classroom, lots of different children, some of those routine things, I'm sure, become more stressful for the child because it doesn't happen. So I think big classrooms are very challenging, I would have thought. Natalie? Nodding.
I'm actually currently teaching in a modern learning environment, the bigger learning environments. And I spent the last year and a half inquiring into what it looks like for the autistic children, what it looks like for those support learners. And I think it is a bit a challenge, but I think it's about the intentional planning for the children on an individual level. And I've really noticed the visuals coming into play. So trying to use those visuals to be able to, like you say, the timetable, like you say, those setups. And I think it's a misconception to say that the open plan, all those things go out the window sometimes because we think that it's too big for the kids. Have you noticed, or is there any research involving the visuals? I think that's the biggest thing that I've really noticed, is having those visuals in place for the kids. Is there anything to back up that with the research part of it?
I suspect there probably is, but it's not something I could comment on, because that kind of research probably comes out of the psychology, education department. Yeah. But I really value your comment. That's great, because we talk about a lot of things that, things like classrooms, etc., that are not something that actually we have any direct experience with. So I appreciate your putting in. Yeah, and the visual things I agree, are extremely important for each individual child. Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you.
Hi. So I'm a specialist and I work in a special needs school as well, very near Natalie. And I just want to know if there's any research going on about processing times in autistic children. So I'd say one of our challenges that we see is the processing time for any input. And therefore, learning it is quite challenging for anything you're trying to teach them, be it toileting, educational learning. And I just wonder if there's anything that's been looked at a synaptic level to know what's actually happening with processing time.
Very big question and very difficult to answer.
I mean, that would be something that would be fantastic to be able to do, but obviously being able to look at synapses in a person who's behaving is unfortunately currently not possible. Having said that, the technology is moving quickly, that I think in our lifetime we will see that. When you do measurements of synapses, and you can actually use something called electrophysiology, and you can actually eavesdrop on synaptic communication between brain cells. When you look at this in brain cells that express autism-associated genetic changes, you see a weakening of that communication, and the kinetics of that communication is also very different. But we can't directly correlate that with behaviour at the moment, but I think we'll get there.
Yeah, and also some EEG and fMRI research has shown that there is potentially some disruptions between different cortical areas. So as Roz said initially, with that white matter, the connectivity between different areas, one of the main theories of autism is that might be disrupted, which would affect processing speed.
It's just because the process seems to happen, it's just that delay. So often when you're anecdotally with a child, we can sit there for a minute after you've given the visual cues, whatever, and suddenly the moment comes. But you have to wait that minute. But then the next kid might be 20 seconds, but then you've got the kids that get it in a flash.
So actually at the cellular level also, something I didn't mention before, it's like, so the connections can also be there and be correct, but it also can be an imbalance between what we think of as sort of the go and the stop cells in the brain, and that's something called the excitation inhibition balance in the brain, and it's becoming very apparent that that balance is off with autism. And so maybe that the process very much is there, but there's too many stoplights, and this has actually been found in Down syndrome as well, that there's just too many stoplights in the brain, and so the processes are there, but they're just being stopped.
As a
I
parent,
think that's also what happens with seizures too. I think that's why about 30% of people with autism have seizures, because it's that balance between the stop and go. There's too much go and not enough stop, or vice versa. Sorry, question.
so as a parent, how is this information getting out there to the education system, the health system, that it actually affects change for our children who are fighting at the moment? And as parents, we're fighting a system that tells us that our children are wrong, that what they are is wrong, when actually, from my point of view, and knowing that my brain's a bit different too, I see it as this has always been there. It's just they're your eccentric people. They're the people you always said were different or weird or strange. So, how is this actually helping, in a sense, stop us as parents having to fight all the time to say it's okay that our children are like this? There's nothing completely wrong about it.
I think when you look at the research, and there is a huge amount and an increasing amount of research around the world, what people want to do is to understand it, because it's very difficult to fight for something that we don't really understand what's going on, because even in terms of thinking about how you help, what you do, you need to understand it, I think, as a first step. And I think autism was only described in the mid-1940s, and it's only really since the 70s people have accepted that people, it's not a psychiatric problem and it's not a parenting problem. So I think it's really only in the last 20 or 30 years that people are going, and this isn't a vaccination problem, that your brain is... sorry, we won't get off on that. No, but what I mean is that this is the way the brain forms. As the brain forms in utero, this is how it forms. It's programmed to form like this. So it's not something that anybody did, and it just happens often to present as a toddler. So I think you're dead right, but I think what these guys are doing and what's really important is to understand what is the fundamental problem with the brain. Not even so long ago, people was like, well, it just doesn't work well. But and I often talk about the hardware and the software. This is a hardware and a software problem. There are fundamental things structurally that are not that are different in an autistic brain. So I think, in the big scheme of things, trying to understand it is really helpful in educating people and increasing, everybody's understanding that this is how some people are made, and this is, what they need to be supported. And we haven't touched on, some people don't want their autism fixed, because it's fantastic and that's the way they are, and we completely accept that. But some people at the other end, I would love to be able to talk to my son or to know what actually goes on in his head. So I think it's that whole huge, big spectrum that we're trying to actually understand.
The Centre of Brain Research, actually, they do a remarkable job of trying to integrate community and public and helping us as researchers who often, whittle away at a desk or a lab for days on end to actually get out there and communicate our research. And I know, for instance, there is, I do believe, I think Bronwyn Connor runs it as part of the Centre for Brain Research. She does run a professional development day for teachers. I think she's done that a few times. So small steps, we're trying to do our best to convey our research where we can. But 100% agree, we could all work a little bit harder to better understand it and get it out there.
One more question. We're technically supposed to stop for drinks and nibbles at 7:30, so maybe just a couple more questions and then we can lurk around and talk some more.
Yeah, thank you. Just asking the panel about what your reflection, or have part of your work or research has been done on anything about applied behavioral analysis and its benefits and with children on the spectrum?
I'm not a specialist. All I know is our School of Psychology has applied behavioral analysis as a big subgroup of our teaching and training. And really it's what we're always told is the gold standard, that the ABA is a good avenue for
My
for
understanding
the
is just the only evidence-based thing that been really studied well is applied behavioral analysis. Does the panel agree with that?
I do.
Thank you.
There are actually people in our Wider Minds for Minds network who are specialist ABA for autism, so very happy to pass on contacts if you'd like more information.
Any quick questions?
I was just wondering, you were talking about auditory processing disorder, and it's very difficult to diagnose, especially if the individual is on the lower end, and often even typically developing people are not diagnosed. Are there any research that focuses on different structures of the auditory processing cortex, or, you know?
I think you might have misunderstood. So I had ASD on mine, so as an autism spectrum disorder. I don't think we've talked about auditory processing, but we do, in our School of Psychology, our head of school is Suzanne Purdy, Professor Suzanne Purdy, and she is an audiologist and she specializes in auditory processing disorder. I'm happy to pass on her details afterwards as well.
Yeah, I was just wondering because Rose mentioned differences in overactivating of the different areas of the cortex. So are there any traits that are specific for individuals with autism, or it's not researched?
So we have some work going on in my lab looking at that. So I very briefly mentioned that. Dr. Juliet Chain, who's a research fellow in my lab, is very interested in the auditory system, and so she's specifically looking at the auditory cortex in model systems of autism spectrum disorders. Too early to say yet what the answers are, but this is actually, I agree, this is actually a very poorly studied area in autism, but it's critical because it's certainly not just in terms of auditory pathways, but that's going to then affect language as well. And so hopefully if we come back in a year or so we can give you some more answers, but just know that it is actually happening now.
Yeah, I had a question. Karen, you were involved with the Cogmed Project, and schools can take it on if they have the resources or want to, but there's no resources, so how do you get programs like that into the schools?
Well, that's a tricky one. So Cogmed, I haven't personal experience with. Are you referring to the moving cog?
I just went to you spoke about it 2 years ago, and the whole thing.
Okay, we call it, okay, it's a different program. So I love Cogmed, but it's very, very expensive. So I was working in the past 5 years with a researcher, David Moreau, and we've come up with a new remediation program called Moving Cog,
That's it, yeah.
which combines the physical activity with the cognitive remediation games. So it's in schools currently, and yeah, we're kind of at a bit of at an impasse because we need more funding to keep it going. We're stalled because of lack of funding. So, but I'm happy to talk to you more about this in the drinks.
Okay, I would like to. And the other question was, if you can do EEGs and put them on people and see which parts of the brains are firing, can you actually distinguish whether it's ADHD, dyscalculia, dyslexia from the results of that?
Yes.
So
That's
if
the short
there's
answer.
so
Yeah,
if
there are biomarkers. So we depending on what task we use. So we have EEG running concurrently while the subject is performing a mental task. The same with the functional MRI. They're in the scanner while they're performing a mental task. And yeah, depending on the task, we can see what areas light up or the signature of the EEG. It's still early days, but we've published a lot of articles suggesting that we can distinguish between disorders.
Thank you.
One last question. Oh, okay. I don't want to hold people up.
Great to be last. Before I make my question, may I point out, it's, as a person with autism, I always get the comment that I'm exceptionally eccentric and odd. So very good to see someone point this out. So I was diagnosed when I was 12 with high-functioning autism, and so after then I was given a waiver for all of my odd activities. But a question that I hold very deeply in terms of education is, if a student is affected by the way that in the classroom, how people act all the way down to their breathing, their the way that their eyes move and so forth, do you think it's somewhat appropriate for the student by request to be able to leave the class and work in a different area? Because it certainly affects me, and even though I do a lot of extension work and have received multiple awards, I still always get held back by that, and it's certainly something that I'm exceptionally annoyed about.
Well, I would have said it was entirely reasonable for you to be able to leave the classroom, given that when my son was at school, they would remove him from the classroom mainly because he was disruptive to the rest of the class, and then they would happily remove him from the classroom and he'd go and work somewhere else. So I think your proposal of being able to leave the classroom sounds entirely reasonable to me, but I'm not in a position, unfortunately, to have any influence over it. But thank you very much for your comment. One person with a very quick question. Yep, I can say that. There are a lot of things that go along, and so if you look carefully at each individual, you will find some of those other things. And when you think about them, they're neurological developmental issues. So low muscle tone, or some difficulty either with gross, big motor movement or fine motor movement. And if you think about it, when we were talking about the brain is wired differently, then it makes sense that there could be some other neurological things in the rest of the body that are a little bit unique as well. So yes, definitely. I don't know that low muscle tone necessarily will tell you or help you in the diagnosis, but it's one of those things you go, oh, yep, okay, there's something else neurological going on here. Maybe it's part of a bigger developmental disorder. Yeah. It'll become clear, and and the odds are it will get, most autism issues do get better as people get older. So, there's a lot of positivity in terms of from a child to where they're going to be later in life. That's a very good question. Is there any link between electronic games and the impact on autism? I would have thought any association, in my very small, humble opinion, is mostly it's probably helpful and very positive. The thing about electronic games and computers in general is they are totally reliably predictable in a way people aren't. So a lot of people on the spectrum do feel very much more comfortable and enjoy interactions with technology, because even when it breaks down, it's, you can figure out what went wrong. So it's very much more reliable. I don't know of any evidence, particularly negative evidence, about using technological devices and a negative impact on autism. There are fantastic resources using devices for communication and a whole lot of other things. So I'm not sure I can think of anything negative about it. I don't know whether you guys have anything to say, or you might like to talk to some of the educational people in the audience. Probably have a much better experience about that. But I think it's the predictability of computers, which is why we know that a lot of high-functioning people with autism have incredible computer skills, because they can learn it and it's reliable and it always behaves in the same way, and that's very reassuring, as opposed to people who do random odd things in, you know, in an unpredictable fashion, which can be very stressful for people on the spectrum. Shall we move into the auditorium and keep talking?
Thank you.